The humanitarian crisis in Gaza deepens as UNRWA suspends aid deliveries amid escalating security concerns. Meanwhile, President-elect Donald Trump's proposed 100% tariffs on BRICS nations threaten global trade and the US dollar's dominance. And in Georgia, a political storm brews as the country halts its EU membership bid, igniting public unrest and electoral tensions. Let's get in focus. The Washington Post's recent piece underscores a harsh reality. Both President Biden and Israel's far-right government share blame for the deepening crisis in Gaza. Biden's unfulfilled promises of a values-based foreign policy and his failure to rein in Israel's extremist policies have left millions of Palestinians trapped in a dire humanitarian catastrophe. Meanwhile, Israel's relentless expansion of illegal settlements and disregard for international law continue to close the door on a two-state solution. As the piece warns, history will not be kind to leaders who chose complicity over action. And to understand the broader implications of this decision, we are joined by Mr. Ahmed Zakarna, a political writer and analyst from Ramallah. Mr. Zakarna, thank you very much for joining us here on Qnews. First off, UNRWA's suspension of aid deliveries has created a crisis within an already dire situation. What are the core reasons behind such a decision?
Good evening to you. The main cause is that the occupied forces authorities executed the general's plans. In the meantime, the international system in testing with respect to humanity, even if there are statements condemned such an act for one reason.
We will try to reconnect with Mr. Zakarna, but Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdel-Ati has inaugurated the Cairo ministerial meeting to enhance humanitarian response in Gaza, hosted under the auspices of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. The Egyptian Foreign Minister condemned Israel's ongoing aggression in Gaza, which has caused immense death, destruction and displacement while violating international law. Abdel-Ati called for an immediate ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian aid and adherence to United Nations resolutions. The conference aims to secure international commitments for sustained aid, immediate relief and long-term recovery for Gaza, emphasizing the need for solidarity and respect for Palestinian rights. Also, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed has urged the international community to support peace efforts and ensure that humanitarian aid reaches Gaza. She described the situation as a humanitarian catastrophe and highlighted the dire conditions of 90,000 malnourished children. She also criticized Israel for obstructing aid and violating international law. Additionally, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General condemned Israel's collective punishment of Palestinians and emphasized the crucial role of UNRWA in maintaining Gaza's stability. Shifting from the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza to the global stage, we now examine the potential fallout from proposed US tariffs on BRICS nations, a move that could reshape international trade and economic relations. The New York Times delves into the implications of Donald Trump's latest warning to BRICS nations, describing it as a bold but risky escalation in his economic agenda. His demand that these nations pledge loyalty to the US dollar or face 100% tariffs highlights his commitment to maintaining the dollar's global dominance. However, the piece points out significant challenges, including potential retaliatory measures a push towards de-dollarization and fears of global market instability. The article aptly frames this as more than just a trade strategy. It's a calculated gamble that could redefine international economic alliances. And to shed more light on this story, we're joined by Mr. Peter Tannis, an economist and author from Washington. Mr. Tannis, thank you for joining us. Now, a 100% tariff would fundamentally disrupt trade between the US and BRICS nations. What impact could this have on the global supply chains in general?
Well, of course, if it happens, it would have an enormous impact. And keep in mind that Trump has been threatening tariffs on just about everything and everybody. The fact is that even a student in economics knows that the impact would be higher inflation. So we've got to look at this. Trump is not stupid, but he is crazy enough that most of his adversaries think that if he threatens these tariffs, he might actually do it. If Obama or Clinton had threatened him, nobody would believe them. But with Trump, they worry that he might be nuts enough to do it.
Well, BRICS nations have been moving towards alternatives to the US dollar. Do you think such a threat or a warning could accelerate the process of the de-dollarization?
Yeah, we have heard this story for decades. The dollar is threatened. Something is going to replace the dollar. Chinese currency is going to replace the dollar. The euro is going to replace the dollar. And guess what? It never happens because most of the trade are done by businesses, and businesses get to choose what currency they want. Most of them choose the dollar because they have faith in US institutions, and they have faith in the institutions that will uphold the value of the dollar. Not so much true for in the case of China or some of the other currencies. So if history is a guide, we should not be too worried about these threats, and Trump's reaction to them are somewhat overblown.
Mm-hmm. So whether such a warning would be serious or a bluff, what long-term geopolitical ramifications do you think it will have if BRICS nations start beginning to shift away from US economic influence?
Yeah, the point is they'll try to do it. They may try to do it, but efforts like this have not succeeded in the past because in free economies, which most of the world are, it is the business people who are going to choose what currency they want to use and what currency they trust. It is highly unlikely that countries like China, Saudi Arabia, which has recently become involved, and Brazil are going to dictate what currencies are being used. So, with all the problems in the world, this is not one I would take very seriously.
Mm-hmm. Well, domestically then, how might this affect the US economic policy domestically, especially in terms of trade relationships with other key nations?
In any event, should we impose tariffs like the ones he has been talking about for a long time, a 10% tariffs on just about everything that comes in the country, it is obvious that this would be inflationary and would raise the prices for just about everything the United States consumes, which is not exactly desirable for the Trump administration. So it is likely more of a threat than it is a reality, and it is unlikely that this will happen. But the simple answer to your question is that if it does happen, there will be retaliation by the countries affected, and they will start imposing tariffs on American and on whatever they import from the United States. And there will be a lot of upset businesses in the United States against the Trump administration if their items cost a lot more to export. So here again, I wouldn't be too concerned about this.
Mr. Tanis, you've mentioned that BRICS nation would still also try and shift the dynamics from the US relations. Now, what potential economic consequences, or political ones, could a shift in trade between the US and BRICS nations have on the global financial system, particularly regarding foreign exchange reserves and investment flows?
70% of the nations of the world keep their reserves or most of their reserves in dollars, 70%. It is not likely to change by any of the measures that we are talking about, by the BRICS or other nations that are trying to make these changes. Again, the answer to your question is, if they succeeded, it would probably have an effect on the value of the dollar. It would probably have an effect on international trade, but don't bet on it because it's not likely to happen.
Then what do you think would be the increasing economic and political influence affect global organizations like the IMF or the World Bank, and what challenges could arise from reshaping this global governance structures?
Probably not much. Remember, the biggest contributor to the IMF and the World Bank is the United States, and we contributed it in dollars. So it's not likely that they would like to see another currency threaten the dollar's dominance. And once again, allow me to point out that we've been talking about this for decades, and so far it hasn't happened. So if you're betting on it, I would bet that the dollar is still going to be the predominantly used currency in world trade.
Well, if BRICS nations strengthen their economic ties and form new trade agreements, how might this alter the competitive landscape for multinational corporations, particularly those based in the US?
It could have some effect, given where the trade is, given what all of them do. Mostly the big antagonist in all this is China. China wants to develop its trade, and it needs strong trading partners. It has a problem with the United States now, so it is looking to other nations. For example, we talk about the BRICS, Brazil being a very important part of that. China is looking to strengthen its relationships with some of these other currencies, and is probably the driving force behind all this. But again, whether they succeed or not is another question.
So do you think Donald Trump would still play into the hands of China this way?
Well, playing into the hands, he is certainly going to confront them. And as I mentioned earlier, and this is really important, he's crazy enough that the threats that he makes have an effect, because some of the people think that he might do something irrational. It is irrational to raise tariffs on just about everything that come into the United States. So it is more likely a trade, because he's crazy but not stupid. It's more likely these are negotiating stances more than anything else. The United States may well come out ahead in the negotiations, but it's certainly not going to be to the extent that he is threatening. I mean, the idea of a 60% tariff on everything that comes in from China, when we import $500 billion worth of goods from China, the inflationary effect of that would be enormous, and Trump can't afford to let that happen.
Mr. Peter Tanis, the economist and author from Washington, thank you very much, sir, for your input. And from the economic strategies shaping the future of global trade, we now turn to a key political development in Europe as Georgia suspends its EU membership bid, a decision with profound implications for the region. As reported by The Guardian Times, Georgia's political situation has escalated following the arrest of opposition leader Zurab Japarezdze during protests against the government's decision to suspend EU accession talks. The protests, which have continued for several nights, reflect growing dissatisfaction with the government's stance, with critics expressing concerns about a potential shift away from pro-Western policies. International observers, including the EU and the US, have raised concerns about democratic backsliding in the country, while the Georgian government maintains that its actions are in defense of national sovereignty. And to discuss these developments, we're now joined by Mr. Nicholas Williams, a former NATO official and European affairs expert from London. Mr. Williams, thank you for joining us. Now, let me ask you, Georgia's decision to pause its European Union membership bid has caused significant political ripples. What are the key factors driving such a decision?
Good evening. The key factors are pressure from Russia, which is fearing a Ukraine-type scenario. The Georgians have negotiated a deal with the EU, and the effect of this deal, a trade deal and also potentially a security deal, will be to detach Georgia from the Russian sphere of influence and interest. And the Russians cannot abide that. And the Russians have been putting pressure on behind the scenes to at least pause the Georgian progress towards Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, this suspension followed accusations of electoral fraud and a crackdown on protests. How does this impact Georgia's political alignment, both domestically and with the rest of Europe?
Well, the alignment of Georgia to Europe and the EU in particular is a process, and it'll take a long time. But the deal with the EU has certain clauses which kick in immediately, or particularly the alignment on trade. And so the Russians are concerned, but also the Europeans are concerned because it's straight out of the Russian playbook in terms of cutting out a democratic will to align the country, Georgia in this case, with the West. The West also has interests in Georgia, particularly as an alternative route for Central Asian oil and trade with Europe, cutting out Russia. And so the West is backing the Georgian interest in Europe, but the Georgian interest, democratic interest, is not forced by the West. It's a reaction to Russian pressure.
Sir, now the domestic sort of reaction to this suspension has really, it was pro-European Union opposition and factions in Georgia. They voiced a lot of strong opposition. How do you think this will affect the Georgian democracy and governance as a whole?
Well, as you know, the Georgian president is due to step down from a mandate in a couple of weeks' time, Salome Zurabishvili, but she has indicated that she will not step down because the elections, she alleges, and there's evidence to back that, was fraudulent, and the actions of the government are anti-constitutional. The Constitution of Georgia requires that they make efforts to join NATO and the EU. And so Georgian democracy is split and is in a problem, and explains the violence on the streets.
Well, Mr. Williams, the current Georgian government faces a lot of accusations of being pro-Russian, while its supporters claim the opposition is attempting to steer Georgia towards becoming another Ukraine. What are your thoughts on this polarized dynamic?
Well, yes, it is a polarized dynamic, and the Georgian government faces a dilemma. They don't want to confront the Russians. They don't want to have the situation of invasion as the Ukraine had. And so from its perspective, it is trying to balance on a tightrope.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, this balancing on the tightrope is risks falling into the Russian hands. Mm-hmm. And they've taken some measures already in May or earlier this year to almost prohibit Western influence in Ukraine, in Georgia. Sorry.
Yes. Well, Mr. Williams, given Georgia's strategic location between Russia and the West, what are the potential security implications of this political crisis for both Georgia and the wider region, including NATO's role?
Well, Georgia borders on Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey also has a difficult balancing problem with Russia. It doesn't want to provoke the Russians too much, but it's firmly in the Western camp in trying to forestall Russian influence. And the Turks will be worried that this falling of the Georgian government for Russia into Russian's arms will make its own position more difficult. And so there are implications, but the West has enough on its plate with Ukraine, and it doesn't want to see another problem with Georgia. And this is why the Russians feel easy in its skin to actually meddle in Georgian affairs.
Mr. Nicholas Williams, the former NATO official and European affairs expert, thank you very much for your insights on Georgia's EU membership situation. And ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our episode today for In Focus. Stay tuned for more topics taking place all around the world. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.